This presentation is really an attempt to summarize some of the research that I've been doing recently into the folklore of the Tanat Valley, where I live in mid Wales. So it's a bit of an experiment trying to draw together some different strands of thinking about this folklore and its relationship not just to the environment around the Tanat Valley, but also to broader themes in psychical research, as this is an ASSAP webinar. Okay, so here's an overview of what I want to talk about. First of all, I'm going to talk about the environment of the Tanat Valley itself, what it's like in the Tanat Valley, its physical structure and all that kind of stuff. Then I'm going to bring in the psychical or experiential component, because I think actually this gives all of the stuff that follows a kind of extra importance, and I'll explain why in a minute. And then I'll survey some of the folklore that I've been able to recover from the Tanat Valley, from various journals and things like that. And it brings up interesting features like fairy hills, the role of giants as cosmogonic kind of creators. And also there's an interesting strand here about the wild hunt and UFOs in this valley. And then we'll finish off by looking at some contemporary leads that I've been able to find, only little tidbits that suggest that maybe some of this folklore does still exist, even if it is kind of just below the surface. And then we'll end up by thinking about different ways of theorizing this kind of phenomenon that we're talking about, of all of these kinds of experiences and folklore clustering around a particular area. And there are different ways of framing this in terms of window areas, and we'll also consider it in terms of sacred geography as well. Okay, so let's begin. So in his classic study, The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, Evans Wentz begins by saying, before we start talking about fairies, it's important to give some attention to the influences and purely natural environment under which the fairy faith has grown up. Okay, so he's saying even, in the early 20th century, that there is a close relationship between the landscape of Celtic countries and the fairy faith that's developed there. Okay, and I think, Wales does have some particularly magical landscapes, and the Tanat Valley could be considered, a magical landscape. But he goes on to say that from the first, our interpretation of environment is fundamentally psychical. So this is an interesting starting point, the idea that the landscape can also be understood from a psychical perspective. And this would include all of those other than human elements in the landscape, different forms of mind, different forms of intelligence, different creatures, things that we might consider dragons and fairies and such, perhaps. Okay, so we'll just have a little look at and try to locate the Tanat Valley now, where it is in the context of the rest of Wales. So this is the north of Wales here, and the Tanat Valley is down here. Just sort of, it begins at the border of Shropshire here, and it runs up, well, actually the river runs down more or less from west to east, down the valley towards England from Wales. And it's about 12 or 15 miles up the valley. And then you end up in the Berwyn Mountains. And the valley is widely regarded as sort of like a gateway to Wales. Lots of tourists come up through the valley, driving up the road up to Bala and then into Snowdonia. So it's kind of like, it's a welcoming entryway into Wales for a lot of people. Okay, so let's have a little bit closer up. So this is the River Tanat. It begins up here, up in the mountains, and then it comes down and it flows all the way down to roughly here. You can see the England border. This is Shropshire over here, and this is Powys here. Okay, so, and it runs pretty much from west to east all the way down. There's a long stretch of valley, and this is what it looks like. Here's Llanganog, this is where I grew up. And this is what the valley looks like from looking down to the east towards Shropshire from Llanganog. Okay. So you can see the kind of landscape. It's hilly terrain, and there are lots of little valleys, side valleys, all various different names. There are little cums. Okay, so this is where I want to bring in the psychical dimension, because obviously there's two different strands to folklore. On the one hand, there are the stories and narratives, and you can do like a narrative study of these traditions, comparing stories and things like that. And these are quite, kind of set pieces a lot of the time. These stories pop up time and time again. And then there are also there's also the experiential side, where people actually experience things like fairies. And the folklorist Simon Young commented on the sort of discrepancy between these two different strands of this phenomenon. So I'll read you his quote here. He says, "I want to give examples where those weird, intimate experiences of the fairy census." So he collected a whole load of contemporary fairy experiences in the fairy census, where they contain fragments of unknowing tradition. Okay, what I mean by unknowing tradition is that the individuals in question had a fairy experience that echoes experiences in traditional fairy lore, but where they had no apparent knowledge of this aspect of fairy lore, although usually there is knowledge. Okay, so he's saying that there's an interesting thing. You've got all of these wild, extraordinary experiences that people have, and then you have these folkloric sort of set pieces. But strangely, those wild experiences still seem to carry some of the hallmarks of those, folkloric motifs. So we've got an interesting question. What's the relationship between the stories and the experiences? And, the cultural source hypothesis, we'll talk about these things slightly later on, but the cultural source hypothesis suggests that culture dictates what our experience is, whereas the experiential source hypothesis from people like David Hufford suggests that the experiences actually give rise to the traditions. Okay, so there's an interesting thing going on here. We've got the stories and we've also got experiences. And very often they echo each other in certain ways. So I'm going to give a couple of examples now, and these are personal experiences. The first one is from my sister. And this was in my parents' house in Llanganog in the Tanat Valley, right at the very far end of the Tanat Valley before you enter into the Berwyn Mountains. And she saw this in my room, and we were trying to work out when it was, and we think it must have been around about 1998 or thereabouts. My sister must have been about 10 or 11 years old. Okay, and she saw this in my bedroom, strangely enough. Okay, and this is what she said. She said, "Okay, so I remember sleeping on the floor in your room, and I'd woken up and I saw the leprechaun standing on a shelf. It looked like it was looking at something on the shelf. I looked up at it to get a better look, and he looked at me, then disappeared. Then I put my head back down on the pillow and looked up again, and he was back. He was sitting down on the shelf, cross-legged, looking at me, smiling. He then jumped up really high, landed on the shelf, and started dancing. I remember smiling at him, and he smiled back, lifted his finger to his lips in a shh way, then disappeared. That's the last time I saw him. It was like he was putting on a show." Okay, so this is a super weird experience that my sister told me, and she told me this at the time, and I was interested at the time, but obviously we were only kids. And I've only just recently asked her to write this up. And now that I look at it, it's full of, just like we were saying, motifs that are quite, that link this experience, what is essentially an extraordinary experience, to broader motifs in the folklore of the fairy world. Okay, so things like the dancing, for example. It goes on. He was really small, maybe 6 inches. He had black pointy shoes on, green knee-length trousers and a green jacket with a waistcoat and white shirt. He didn't have a beard but had red hair. He had a green hat on. Everything he was wearing looked well worn, not bright green, more forest green. Okay, so again, it sounds, the fact that the clothes are well worn, for instance, these are interesting features. These are actually quite, we could say realistic features, aren't they? This is what she said. "That's what I can remember. It looked like he was looking for something in your room when I first saw him." Okay, so that's very strange. He was happy, but didn't speak or make any noise. Okay, and that's the end of her explanation of this experience. Okay, so this is a strange experience. It happened a long time ago, long before my sister, well, my sister's not particularly interested in folklore, not to the extent of researching it anyway, and long before I had done any, real research into the folklore of the area. Of course, growing up here, I'd heard stories of things, but to be honest, never anything about fairies specifically. There are some stories that are well known in our area about a dragon in Llanrheidr, and the folklore around Pennant Melangell and Saint Melangell and the hare and that kind of thing. These are well known stories, but not so much about fairies, at least not that I was aware of at the time. Okay. And that's relevant here as well, because, well, first of all, here we go. We'll plot the first experience onto this map. So my sister's experience here took place in Llangynnog, probably in 1998 or thereabouts. Okay, and the fact that we didn't have any awareness of the fairy folklore associated with the valley also has relevance with my own experience, which I've recently written about. I've written about it in a few places now. Firstly, I think it was the first issue of the Psychedelic Press. I wrote about my experience there, and I also submitted my experience to Simon Young's Fairy Census. Okay, so this is my experience as I described it for the Fairy Census, which I consider to be like my definitive account of it. But recently I've written about it in this book as well, by Joshua Cutchin, exploring the weird relationship of my experience to popular culture as well, and especially the imagery of Brian Froud, which to me seemed to encapsulate what these beings look like. And I should say that this experience that I had was in the context of my first ever psilocybin mushroom trip. Okay, so it's a psychedelic fairy encounter. And this is what I say. So I noticed these small two-dimensional creatures walking in procession in the grain of wood on a chest of drawers. There was one larger member of the procession that appeared to be female and in charge. The entities had long pointed noses, appeared organic, like beautiful little goblins, and were sort of swirling along in their procession. The largest one turned to look at me, noticed I was looking, and then continued with its procession. I shouted out to the other two people in the room, "I can see fairies," because I didn't know what else to call them. The fairies just continued to move along the grain of the wood, and I stopped paying attention to them. It was a strange experience. They seemed to be different to the rest of the psychedelic experience because they were moving along with deliberate intent and seemed to possess a consciousness of their own. They clearly noticed me, but were not concerned that I'd spotted them. Okay, the memory is still very vivid in my mind. And I summarize it here. They were like small, two-dimensional, beautiful goblins, and they had long pointed noses. And often, if people ask me to describe them, these are some drawings that I did, I don't know, quite a few years ago now of these creatures. I would say that they looked like something from Brian Froud's Fairies book. Okay, and that's what I explore in this chapter here. Okay, so I had this experience of seeing fairies. This must have been around 2003. Okay, so still I wasn't investigating the folklore in any depth. I wasn't aware of any specific fairy folklore in the valley, but I had this experience, and it's been a profound and important experience for me in lots of different ways. Okay, and it still sticks with me today. Okay, so we can plot this on it. This experience occurred in Pen-y-bont Fawr, in my friend's house. Okay, so we've got two psychical experiences here. I'm not saying that these are necessarily real experiences or anything like that. Well, they're real experiences, but I'm not saying that they're proof of the existence of fairies. But there is, it has to be said, sort of a synchronicity going on here, that people should have these same kinds of experiences in places or in this valley location where, as we'll see, there is actually a long tradition of fairy folklore that neither of us were aware of at the time of the experiences that we had. So I didn't start to really delve into the fairy folklore of the valley until last year, when my friend gave me a copy of this book, A Wanderer in North Wales by Cledwyn Hughes. And Cledwyn Hughes was a Labour MP. I think he was MP for Anglesey. And he wrote this book, which was sort of a travelogue of his wanders, as he says, through North Wales, walking through the valleys in the sort of 1940s and 50s. And he gave me this book because it has a specific mention of the Tanat Valley in it, where I live and where I was living at the time, Llanrhaeadr Mochnan, which is just down the road from where I'm living now. Okay, so I'll just read you this little extract here. In the valley of the Tanat, which is what we're talking about, is Llanrhaeadr and Mochnant, with its rush of waterfall. In this valley too is Llangynog, where I grew up, in shadow of the Berwyn Mountains. The bleak Berwyn Mountains with the Pennant Glen is famous as the haunt of the fairies. So when I read this, famous as the haunt of the fairies, all of a sudden I was like, hang on a minute, the Pennant Glen, famous as the haunt of the fairies? I've never heard this specifically before. The Pennant Glen to me is famous as the site of, St. Melangeth's Church, not as the home of the fairies. So this piqued my interest immediately, and my heart was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And he goes on and describes it in such rich Gothic detail. He says, and the hounds of hell haunt and hunt these mountains. The devil is their huntsman, and the hounds are bright red as they hunt in the air. They drop blood to the slopes beneath, and they chase the souls of the newly departed. Their souls have been sent to the dark slopes of the Berwyns to wait, those who are damned. Wow. Okay, so this is lots of interesting stuff about this area that I've grown up in that I had never encountered until my friend gave me this book. Okay, so very interesting. And then this led me to dig deeper than I'd ever done before in terms of like researching the folklore. I had written a few articles about folklore, I think in 2015, but the extent of my research was, I was, to be perfectly honest, reasonably disappointed that I wasn't able to find much of substance, but now I've been able to find much more. Okay, so this book was the trigger for me to delve a little bit deeper. And one of the things that I did find as I delved deeper was I found out about this wonderful local archaeologist called Robert Richards, who grew up in Llangynog, where I grew up, and had a passion for collecting folklore from the valley in the 1930s. So he wrote a couple of papers in the Journal of the Powisland Club, which is the sort of the learned society for Powys, where he collected not only giant stories, but also some fairy stories from the Tanat Valley. Okay, and he made a few interesting comments about the folklore of the Tanat Valley in the 1930s, which I think give us a sense of the way that things have progressed on, to today, and where we might be in terms of people's awareness of this folklore. Okay, so he says, traditions and fables, so it is sometimes claimed, die hard on the countryside, and one would naturally expect in the remoter recesses and valleys of our county, such as the Upper Tanat Valley, that heroic tales of long ago would be plentiful enough. One regrets to note, however, that they are much less frequently heard today than they were only a short generation ago. Can it be that our system of education has finally banished from our rural hamlets not only the terrifying ghosts which occasionally, it must be admitted, assumed most grotesque forms, but the gossamer-like fairy as well? So he's saying, even in the 1930s, this folklore had begun to disappear, and there was very little kind of public awareness of it. And this kind of echoes what I have been finding recently, I think. I'm trying to find out a little bit more in more detail. But and this is also my experience, that this folklore has been forgotten, more or less. And it requires going into the archives to reveal bits of it, which is what I've done. So we're going to think a little bit about fairies then, because I have found some interesting fairy folklore from the Tanat Valley. But before we do that, I just want to say a few things about Welsh fairies as a distinct, variety of fairies amongst all of fairy lore. So the Reverend Elias Owen, he is actually a local reverend. He was based in a village just down the road from here. And his book, Welsh Folklore, is really useful for me because he did collect folklore stories from around this particular area. And this is something that I've noticed, is that lots of folklorists, historical folklorists, have collected stories from this area, but they're all in disparate books. They're all in different places. And so what I want to try and do is try and bring all of the stories together from different books, different journals and different sources to compile a body of folklore specifically for the valley. Okay, and so relying on people like Elias Owen is very valuable. And he gave a really useful overview of different Welsh names for the fairies. Okay, so there are many different varieties of fairies. Okay, so we've got a Tolwyth Teg. This is probably the most common name for the fairies, which is a strange translation of the fair folk. Tolwyth means folk, and Teg means, literally fair. There's Bendith a Mamai, the blessing of the mothers, strange term for the fairies. They're sometimes also referred to as Ellyllon, which could be considered a sort of a Welsh version of the Anglo-Saxon elf, maybe. Sometimes they're referred to as Dynion Bach Teg, little fair men. Coblynau, which perhaps might be translated as goblins, and Gwylltiaid, who are wild mountain fairies, amongst others. There's an interesting thing about the Gwylltiaid, because in this area, there is a folk tradition of the Gwylltiaid Cohesion, who were a group of red-headed bandits who lived around here back in, I'm not sure when. And they used to raid, villages and all sorts of things, and were sort of rounded up and hung, executed, and then came back and had their revenge. I even did a school play about it when I was a child. But what I didn't know was that the term Gwylltiaid actually was, referring to fairies. And the Gwylltiaid Cohesion, these red-headed bandits, had taken that name in order to strike fear into the people. They were red-headed fairies from the mountains. Okay, so interesting stuff to do with the names of the fairies in Wales. But and the earliest written record of the most common Welsh word for the fairies, Tolwyth Teg, is from a poem dated to 1500 or so. Okay, so it's quite an old terminology that we've got here. Okay, and then just to sort of characterize these fairies, what they're like, the folklorist Robin Gwyndaf gives us a useful little explanation. He says in Wales, the fairies are thought to be non-ghostly apparitions. Their habits and activities resemble those of men. It was once believed that the taller type were inclined to dishonesty. They stole butter and cheese and milked cows and goats. The smaller race, which figure most prominently in Welsh tradition, on the other hand, were beautiful and gentle folk. They were playful, fond of music and dance, and kind to mortals. Reports of their actual size vary, but generally they were held to be the size of a 6-year-old child. So we have a variety of fairies in Welsh tradition, ranging from large fairies down to small fairies. Okay, and they do all of the usual fairy mischief. So here's an interesting example then that I found in the Oswestry Bygones, and I think it was written by Elias Owen. The reason I say I think it was written by Elias Owen is because all of the submissions to the Bygones are supposed to be anonymous, but the initials that are placed by EO, Elias Owen, and it's in his sort of folkloric writing style. Okay, so I think it's Elias Owen's account of this experience. And this experience occurred in a place called Bulchadar, which is just off the Tanat Valley. I'll show you where it is. Here it is. And this is the account. He says, a good while ago, a forager lived in a small house in a place called Bulchadar, a hamlet between Llangedwin and Llanfyllin. His name was Robert Jones. He lived alone. One night, Robert Jones was aroused from refreshing sleep by a noise in his room. He had only a kitchen with a small trestle bed in the corner of his room. He sat up in his bed and saw a small man fiddling like mad, seated on the post of the bed, and small men and women dancing all about the room in great glee. For a while, he looked on with wonder, and at last he said, "Who are you?" The fiddler, with merriment in his twinkling eyes, said, "We are spirits of the air, ysbrydion o'r awyr." "But what do you want here?" "Only a dance, and we are going to come here tomorrow night too." "No, you won't," said Robert Jones, and he added with something more like an oath than any other kind of expression, "I tell you, you won't. The landlord shall be told of this, and then come if you dare. This threat was quite enough for the intruders, and Robert Jones was never disturbed afterwards. All this took place towards the early part of the present century. Okay, so this is a story presented as a true story, a true account of an experience that took place at the beginning of the 1800s in Bulchadar. And what's really interesting about this, especially when you compare it to my sister's experience from 1998, the small person appearing in the room, the dancing, the merriment in his twinkling eyes. And then I love this mysterious element, the spirits of the air. So this seems to be almost as well hinting at an animistic sort of vision. Okay, so this is the first experience from the folklore that I'm going to add onto this map. So we've got my sister's experience then of the little dancing gnome, or not gnome, leprechaun she described him as. My own psychedelic experience of the small fairy creatures in the chest of drawers. And then this experience in Bulchadar of the spirits of the air dancing around in the bedroom. Now I want to turn to one of probably the most active, that's a funny way of saying it, most active fairy area in the Tanat Valley, which is Craig Rhuarth. Craig Rhuarth is a mountain. This is Llanganog, this is where I grew up here. And I spent a lot of time in my youth scrabbling all over this mountain, climbing up into it and exploring. Here's a picture of me emerging from one of the caves on the mountain one night where we've been having a jam session deep in the cave. Okay, so I've been quite familiar with this mountain for a long time and have explored it all over it. And I knew it was an Iron Age hill fort, but I wasn't aware of any specific fairy folklore until I delved into the archives. Okay, so Craig Rhuarth, it says, and Robert Richards, remember, he grew up in Llanganog and, like me, spent his childhood climbing over this mountain. He says, Craig Rhuarth is the earliest haunt of fairies with which I was privileged to be intimately acquainted. The rings with which the southern slopes of the hill are more or less covered, these rings that he's referring to are actually the hut circles of Iron Age. There's an Iron Age hill fort on the top, and there are lots of hut circles on the hill. You can see here, there are hundreds of them. Okay, and the belief was that these hut circles mark the exits from which the fairies emerged when twilight gathered or mist descended on the hill, and into which they disappeared again with the emergence of the full daylight. So this is a really interesting, interpretation of these features, Iron Age features on this massive hill fort, which I had not been aware of before. I knew about the features, but I didn't know that in the folklore, there were also portals through which fairies entered. Amazing, okay? So this is a real fairy hill. This is a place where it was believed that the fairies would come from, emerge from, and emerge back into. This is also, like Cledwyn Hughes was talking about, you climb up here, up the road, up past the mountain, Craig Rhuarth, and up here you're into the Berwyn Mountains, which we'll talk about later. Okay, so Craig Rhuarth. Here I am again. Here's the mountain, and you can see all the Iron Age hut circles on here, which are also fairy portals, according to the folklore. I also found another interesting account in the book Celtic Folklore by John Rees, who was one of the first professors of Celtic studies, first published in 1901, and he refers specifically to Craig Rhuarth, the mountain. Okay, so he says, take for instance a cave in the part of Rhuarth Rock near to Cwm Glanhavan, in the neighbourhood of Llanganog in Montgomeryshire. Into that, according to Cundello in the Brython, for 1860, page 57, some men penetrated as far as the pound of candles lasted with which they had provided themselves, but it appears to be tenanted by a hag who is always busily washing clothes in a brass pan. So there's an amazing story then of these caves up on the slopes of the mountain. I've got the, here's the mountain. This is Cwm Glanhavan here that they're talking about. So you can quite easily pinpoint which caves they're referring to, where it was claimed men had gone in and encountered a hag living down there, stirring her brass pan. And this idea of the brass pan has got lots of resonances with, Celtic mythology. And I wonder whether it's any coincidence that just over the Berwyn Mountains, as you get over to Bala, you've got Bala Lake, which is the cauldron of Ceridwen, the witch, where Taliesin, the poet, was basically created. All sorts of magical associations. So very interesting. I also found Robert Richards referring to a lady all dressed in white, who was for many years the unhappy denizen of one of the disused quarries in the River Valley. So again, there's this interesting association then of women of the mountain. Yeah. But specifically in Craig Cruath, in the mountain where I grew up. And I was not aware of this. Very odd. Okay, so super strange. Here's another view of the same cliffs from on the mountain. Another interesting feature on this mountain that emerged recently during the lockdowns was a sort of like a painted stone trail, but amongst the stones were an abundance of fairy images. Okay, so now I'm wondering, about this idea of the land expressing something. Because if this fairy folklore is not so well known, then this is a very weird coincidence that there should be all of these pictures, paintings of fairies, on the hillside. Unless whoever did these paintings knew about this folklore. Or it could be some kind of subtle influence from the landscape that influences or inspires people to create this kind of fairy imagery. Very interesting to think about. It's a strange recent manifestation of a fairy association with the mountain. And again, we don't know whether this is a conscious association or maybe even a subconscious association. But I think it's very interesting. Another fairy hill in the Tanat Valley is Llanymynech Hill. Okay, so if you flow down the River Tanat from Craig Cruath, which we've just been talking about, and you stay on the river, you'll come to the end of the valley, and the river merges with the River Vyrnwy and then flows into the River Severn. And at that point, you'll come across Llanymynech Hill, more or less. And there's an abundance of fairy folklore about Llanymynech Hill, which I had not been aware of. Okay. Again, so here's Llanymynech Hill. The Reverend William Bingley reports, the cavern in Llanymynech Hill, not far from Oswestry, has been long noted as the residence of a clan of fairies, to whom the neighbouring villages attribute many surprising and mischievous pranks. Whilst they have stopped to listen at the mouth of the cave, the people state that they have sometimes even heard the little elves in conversation. But this was always in such low whispers that the words, which were reverberated along the sides and roof of the cavern, could not be distinguished. The stream that runs across a distant part of this cavern is celebrated as the place where the fairy washerwoman and labourers have been heard frequently at work. So again, we have this fairy washerwoman motif in the caves in the mountains of the Tanat Valley. Okay, but there's more. Okay, here's Llanymynech Hill. It's quite an extraordinary hill. It's been used for thousands of years. There are Roman mines on here. And again, this is another theme, ancient monuments in the landscape being reinterpreted by later generations as being fairy activity. Okay, so this is Llanymynech Hill, and it's full of caverns and tunnels. There's even stories of tunnels that lead out underneath the hill. Okay, tradition says this labyrinth communicated by subterranean paths with Carreg Castle, a nearby castle. And some persons aver that they have gone into it so far as to hear the rivers Vyrnwy and Tanat rolling over their heads, and that it leads down to fairyland. So this is another very interesting association with the valley, the Tanat Valley. That actually here, Llanymynech Hill, there is a tunnel that goes down underneath the River Tanat, leading to fairyland. So very strange. But very interesting. So we're starting to build up a bit of a picture here of some interesting fairy associations. There are other fairy associations in the valley. This is in Llansilin, a place called Bryn Ellis, which essentially translates as Elf Hill. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find any specific folklore relating to the hill, but places are usually named for a reason. So I think there's more research to be done here. Why is this place called Elf Hill? Okay, so Bryn Ellis then is up here, the Elf Hill by Llansilin. Okay, so we have actually the Elf Hill here, Llanymynech Hill, which is a fairy hill, and over here we've got Craig Rhuarth, which is a fairy hill as well. The archaeologist Robert Richards also wrote an amazing paper about the giant stories from the Tanat Valley, and he notes that in the traditions of the valley there were three giants who were brothers essentially. Okay, there was Cawr Berwyn. Cawr just means giant, so Cawr Berwyn, and obviously the Berwyn Mountains share his name. There was his brother Cawr Rhuddwyn, and also Cawr Myfyr. Okay, so of the three giants aforementioned, Cawr Berwyn is the one that has left us most evidence of his former existence and exploits. Traditions concerning him seem to have centered chiefly around Cwm Bloti and Tanat Valley. So let's just go here. Tanat Valley is up here, and Cwm Bloti is over here by Llanrhaeadr y Mochnant. Okay, so these two areas are specifically associated with the activities of this giant Cawr Berwyn. In Cwm Bloti by Llanrhaeadr y Mochnant, we have these massive boulders, huge geological features, presumably left by glacial activity. But these are known as Barclodiad y Gawres, or Barclodiad y Gawr, sorry, the giant's apronful. And the story is that Cawr Berwyn was trying to build a bridge across this valley so that he could see his brothers, Myfyr and Rhuddwyn. And he wanted to do it in secret to surprise them that he'd built this bridge. But he wasn't able to do it. The rocks were too heavy, so he just gave up. When the sun came up, he decided to go back to bed, and he dropped the rocks. And the rocks are still there, visible today. And they are quite immense, impressive rocks to climb on and to look at. Okay, so Cawr Berwyn is responsible for dropping these rocks here according to the valley's folklore. Okay, so we've got the activity here of Cawr Berwyn as well to add into our equation. There is also more of this sort of giant theme at Tanat Valley. I've already mentioned Tanat Valley a few times. It's most famous as the church that was established by Saint Melangell, who is the patron saint of hares. And the story is that Melangell had fled from Ireland from an arranged marriage, and she'd found this little valley, secluded valley, to live a life of solitary reflection. And then one day, Prince Brochwil of Skithrog was coming through hunting this hare, and the hare came into an opening in the woods where Melangell was praying and ran under her dress and hid there. And the prince was so impressed with Melangell's piety that he declared the whole of the valley a sanctuary for wildlife and said that there would no longer be any hunting there. Which is very interesting considering the fact that today the valley is actually home to one of the largest pheasant shoots in Wales. Interesting. And in fact, there have been newspaper articles the past few years about the threat posed to the actual physical structure of this church by the shoot, which often shoots over the church buildings. Okay, so a blatant disregard of the folklore there. But in the church, they have this relic here known as Asen y Gawres, the giantess's rib bone. Okay, so we have this, again, this nice, in the valley, this sort of physical presence of giants. The giantess's rib bone was thought to either have been retrieved from the grave of Saint Malangesh, but there are no other stories of Malangesh being a giant, so that's an unusual story, or that it has been found in the Berwyn Mountains, which is also unusual because it's a whalebone. Okay, but anyway, there is this folkloric association of the giants of the Tanat Valley, and things like this are taken as evidence for their existence, as well as the massive mounds of rocks that lay strewn about the place. Okay, so we have up here, as well as all of the legends of Pen Malangesh, and as well as this area being well known according to Cledwyn Hughes as the haunt of the fairies, we also have the giantess's rib. There is also relics of Malangesh as well. Okay, so again, our valley is beginning to fill up with interesting things. So I'm just going to turn now to Cawr Berwyn's brother, Cawr Rhuddwyn, who lived much closer to where I live now. At the top of, there's a hill known as Caer Rhuddwyn. I'll show you. Here's the hill. At the top of this hill, there is a fort, another Iron Age fort known as Caer Rhuddwyn. Okay. And in the fort, there used to be, I'm not sure if it's still there, I need to go up. There used to be a large cairn that was known in the valley as Beer the Cawr, which means the giant's grave. And it was thought that this was where Cawr Rhuddwyn was buried. Yeah, and as I already said, Rhuddwyn was one of these three giants of the valley. And Robert Richards, again, the archaeologist, found an amazing little notice written by Mr. William Morris of Llansilin. So this is from the village nearby to this mountain, writing in 1678. And he says, the following: that an unheard of Morris dance is to be celebrated on the grave mound of Rhuddwyn Gawr Mawr. Rhuddwyn Gawr Mawr means Rhuddwyn, big giant, a Cimmerian giant of 60 feet in length and 9 in height above the ground, by Marsley Hain, aged 140. So presumably there was this old woman who used to live in Llansilin, and every year she would go up to the cairn on top of the hill fort and would dance, do a Morris dance on the grave of Cawr Rhuddwyn, the giant. Okay, so this is super interesting as well. Here's the hill, and there is an interesting association of the hill with giants, and also with a sort of veneration of the giants as well. A sort of, a ritual, practical engagement with these figures. So this is interesting. On top of the hill, there is a lake which is known as Llyn Rhuddwyn as well, Rhuddwyn's Lake. So this whole hill has this strong association with this giant. Okay, so we can add this onto the list. Not only do we have up here by Llansilin the Elf Hill, Bryn Ellill, but we also have the giant's grave where Marsley Hain, a 140-year-old woman, would go and do her Morris dance in celebration of the giant. Okay, so filling up again. Now, this is where we're going to start to move towards more contemporary kinds of experiences now. But before I do that, I just want to return back to Cledwyn Hughes, who, if you remember, he said that the devil rides around in the Berwyn Mountains and the souls of the dead are dashed on the mountain sides. Okay, but he makes this interesting comment about the Hounds of Hell. And I think we can assume when he's talking about the Hounds of Hell, he's actually talking about the Cwnanwn, who are the sort of, hellhounds from Celtic Welsh mythology. Okay, and when he's talking about the devil, he's not talking about the devil, but he's actually talking about Gwyn ap Nudd. And Gwyn ap Nudd is the king of the fairies in Welsh mythological tradition. And Gwyn ap Nudd, like Odin and others, leads the wild hunt in Wales. So this is what Cledwyn Hughes says. He says, people have seen the hounds in full cry across a low sky. Mountain farmers have heard the awful baying, the once heard sound of a lifetime. On wild nights, late travelers pedal fast, and in the cars the eyes blink and watch as the road unfolds in the headlamps. Not with the best of gay companions would I hike over the Berwyns at night, when the wind is high and the rain hisses from the tops of the rocky places. It's a very, very evocative image of the Berwyn Mountains, and it's very accurate as well, because you wouldn't want to go up there at night. But he also describes this vision of the Hounds of Hell running through the sky. Okay, here's another little bit about the Hounds of Hell from the writings of Edmund Jones, who was a sort of a priest in Wales who collected fairy stories as evidence for the existence of the spiritual realm. Okay, he says, they were often heard before burials what by some were called Cwn Anwn, Hounds of Hell, by others Cwn Bendith y Mamau, Hounds of the Fairies, and by some Cwn Wybr, Sky Hounds, or Wybr are like, a Wybr is like a viper, a serpent. The nearer they were to a man, the less their voice was, and the farther the louder, sometimes like the voice of a great hound, sounding, of a great horn sounding among them, that should say, like that of a bloodhound, a deep, hollow voice. So there's this association of the wild hunt then with fire in the sky and these loud sounds, booming sounds. Okay, and I think this is particularly interesting when we look to what happened in the Berwyn Mountains in the 1970s, the famous Berwyn Mountain UFO incident. Okay, I've taken this extract from the eyewitness Pat Evans from Andy Roberts's excellent little book on the Berwyn incident. And what I like about this book is that Andy does a great job of sort of explaining away most of the things that happened on that night, you know, in relatively mundane terms. But the one thing that he admits that can't be explained adequately is Pat Evans's experience, which is the experience that really initiated the whole flurry around it. She certainly had some kind of unusual experience on that night. Okay, so this is what she described. She says, we could see to our left this huge round orange ball sitting on the mountain. And so we looked at it, couldn't make it out. So we went further up to the county border, as we called it. So we turned round and sort of parked. Now it was to the right as we were heading for home. We opened the windows and looked down, and there was no sound. It was quiet. There was nothing really, just looking at this huge orange ball, and there was no windows in it, no doors, and it seemed to be pulsating or glowing like a huge ember. There were no flames shooting or anything like that. It was very uniform, very round in shape. Whatever it was, it did not appear to be obviously three-dimensional. It was a flat, round, looking at it like that. They were like torchlights, not great big torches and searchlights, more like fairy lights really from where we were standing. And they seemed to be pretty uniform, sort of coming towards this thing. So there's a few things in this that are really interesting. Not only is this a high strangeness UFO encounter with a luminous, two-dimensional seeming object in the Berwyn Mountains, just above Llanganog, where I grew up. It's also associated with these, she describes as fairy lights, smaller lights that are coming towards it. And what this makes me think of is Gwyn ap Nudd and the wild hunt. So I wonder whether we're dealing with a modern iteration of the wild hunt in this experience. It's just a thought, but you know, there's a lot of associations here going on. Okay, so we can add this up here as well. We've got the Berwyn UFO incident from 1974 and all of this interesting association with Gwyn ap Nudd, the king of the fairies. In fact, some early Celtic scholars even suggested that Berwyn, the term Berwyn, the Berwyn Mountains, refers to Gwyn ap Nudd as a mutated form of Bryniau Gwyn ap Nudd, the hills of Gwyn ap Nudd. So perhaps this whole area has a long association with the fairies and with extraordinary kinds of experiences, even in the contemporary world. So this is where I want to turn to the contemporary world and just have a look at a few little leads that I was able to find. And what I did, I wrote a little article in our local newspaper about some of the things that I found out from Cledwyn Hughes and a few other places, just as a little interest piece for the newspaper. But I asked if anyone had any stories or any experiences. And I got a very sort of slim response, but I did get a few interesting little snippets which we can add into our picture of what's going on in the valley. So a couple of interesting examples. Here's one. Nanny always said she saw fairies in Golva Isav playing at the top of the garden. So Golva Isav is a house. It's actually just down the road from where I live here. Here we could put that onto the map. We will do in a minute. Another little tidbit that I got was John's grandmother always swore she saw fairies in the garden when she lived in Kai Mice. It would have been in the very late 40s, early 50s. It's always been a done story. Who knows? And Kai Mice is a house over towards the Pennant Glen near to Llanganog where I grew up. Okay, so another fairy experience allegedly reported in this area, not far from where I had my experience, where my sister had her experience. Someone else said those fairies still exist, especially between Hirnant and Llanwddyn. And the land between Hirnant and Llanwddyn is particularly sort of barren, desolate land. It's sort of no man's land in the middle of nowhere. So there's interesting association there with the wilderness and the fairies. Another person said, by the lime kilns, Porthwine, the little people live. Well, the lime kilns at Porthwine are just on the other side of Llanymynech Hill. So there's evidence there to suggest that there is still an association of that hill in the contemporary world with the fairies. And another one, which is relevant to my own experience, I think, but I think may well be relevant more broadly. I think it was given in a slightly tongue-in-cheek sense, but it's actually hitting the nail on the head in some respects. And they said, wherever there are mushrooms, there are fairies. Okay, so there are still ideas about fairies in this area, which is interesting. But these are only little tidbits, and I haven't been able to find out much more beyond them. I have inquired, but I haven't received anything extra. Okay, so this is an interesting point that has been noted by other folklorists as well. So here's the Welsh folklorist Robin Gwyndath, and he's describing this kind of situation that we're in today. So today, these passive tradition bearers who have inherited fairy lore are decreasing in number, and when they die, their legends may die with them. There are and there will be other more contemporary narratives, but these men and women must be recorded now, for their like will not be heard again. So this is exactly the same situation that Robert Richards was describing in the 1930s, that even in the 1930s, the folklore was beginning to be lost. These older stories were not being told. And he's saying then that this process is still taking place today, but also, that people still may create new narratives as well. Okay, so there are also interesting threads of new narratives that might be emerging in the Tanat Valley. Okay, so here we are then. There are probably other things that I could add on here. I've added on the fairies between Hirnant and Llanwddyn. This is where the fairies in the garden were seen up here in Kai Mice. This is where Golva Isav is, where someone claimed to have seen fairies in the garden. Okay, so again, it's all just adding into this rich tapestry of fairy tradition and folklore of the Tanat Valley. So what I want to do now, just to sort of begin to wrap up, is to think about ways of theorizing this and putting it into a sort of a theoretical framework. So one thing that we could ask is whether there is an experiential basis to some of this folklore. And I think we could make that case for example, these experiences that seem to be located around houses, household fairy experiences, like the experience from Bulchadar of the man waking up in his bedroom and seeing these beings dancing in his bedroom. I mean, this is remarkably similar to my sister's experience, for example. So this suggests that there is possibly, at least in some of these instances, maybe not with the giants so much, but certainly with this kind of fairy folklore, that there might be an experience that gives rise to the tradition. And this is exactly what the folklorist David Hufford said about the old hag tradition. And David Hufford gives us the experiential source hypothesis. So he says the primary theoretical statement of the experiential source hypothesis might be roughly summed up as follows. Some significant portion of traditional supernatural belief is associated with accurate observations interpreted rationally. So that is real experiences. This does not suggest that all such belief has this association. So not all belief necessarily is associated with an experience, but certainly some is. And he also goes on to say, nor is this association taken as proof that the beliefs are true. So, for example, there might be alternative explanations for why a particular kind of experience has happened, for example, neurological reasons or whatever, or drug reasons, as in my own experience, maybe. That might be a way to explain it away. Okay. But it's interesting, isn't it, that there is this association between the experience and a correlation between the folklore and the experiences. So we could ask then, are the experiences of my sister and myself coupled with other reported memorates? So a memorate is a story presented that is, presented as if it's true, believed to be true by the person. Are these things evidence for an experiential basis to some of the folklore of the Tanat Valley? So like I was saying, maybe there is something in the valley. Maybe there is something that gives rise to these experiences, and the folklore is actually founded on the experiences. It's a possibility. And if that's the case, then we can start to think about that. The Fortean writer John Keel talked about window areas. He defined, this is how he explains a window area. He says, we have a theory, it's not very scientific, but it's based upon the known facts. These creatures and strange events tend to recur in the same areas year after year, even century after century. This in itself indicates that the creatures somehow live in those areas, which we call windows. So, we could take this, it may be considered an extreme perspective maybe, but that these creatures actually exist in the Tanat Valley and that occasionally we encounter them, but we don't tell as many stories about them anymore. So maybe this is a window area, perhaps. It's one way of saying it. But, when we say that, Peter McHugh, in his great book, Zones of Strangeness, reminds us, when we say this, when places are described as hotspots or window areas, the tacit assumption is that the geographical concentration of incidents is more than a statistical fluke. So it could just be a coincidence. It could be. But it's a strange coincidence. Why should, for example, there be a relationship between the story of the guy in Bulkhadar at the beginning of the 19th century and my sister's experience in 1998? Where is the association? Is this more than just a statistical fluke? It could be. So again, it leads us to think about this in different ways. Okay, so I want to bring in some more theorists here. These are theorists on the sacred, but they're relevant here because we're thinking about the nature of these folkloric traditions. Do they emerge from the land and from experience, or are they just cultural narratives that are shared and exchanged? So the historian of religion, Messier Eliade, had a particular view of the sacred. His idea of the sacred was that it exists out in the world and that people go to a particular place where there is what he called a hierophany, or an eruption of the sacred as a real thing into the world, and people have an experience in that place. So here, if we were to take an Eliadean perspective, then we would say that there is something special about the Tanat Valley that's giving rise to these experiences, that they're emerging from the land in some way. And there's lots of different ways that we can interpret that. We could be thinking in terms of like weird geomagnetic activity, strange radiations and stuff like that. All of these issues like tectonic strains, perhaps, Earthlight's kind of approach. Or it could be, some kind of a genuine or supernatural kind of force, perhaps. Okay, so that's the camp of Eliade, suggesting that there's something in the land that's coming out. Whereas Durkheim suggests that the sacred is actually socially constructed through human activities, so that the sacred doesn't actually exist. It's just kind of created by human beings for social functions, usually to bind society together, social cohesion. So which direction do we take? Do we take Eliade's perspective, where he's suggesting that we can have experiences in the land, and perhaps that's what me and my sister had, and that's why they resonate with the traditions? Or is it more of a cultural thing, and these cultural ideas are just diffused, and we have experiences because we're exposed to the culture? Another theorist, Rudolf Otto, kind of bridges the gap between both of these theorists. Okay, Rudolf Otto is most famous for his work on the numinous, the experience of the wholly other, he described it as. He said that when we encounter something strange and weird, like God, for example, that we can have, we have a dual kind of experience, the mysterium tremendum, which is the fear and awe, and then we have the mysterium fascinans, which is the beauty and wonder of the experience. So he describes the numinous as this kind of feeling response that we have when we're exposed to something other, the wholly other. Okay, so he's like Eliade in that respect, in suggesting that there is something out there wholly other in the landscape. And he says that this sense of the numinous arises when we interact with certain places where this force is kind of bubbling up. So perhaps the Tanat Valley is one of these places, a sort of a haunted place. He says in these places, the implicit meaning may be rendered explicit. It's already the beginning of this explicative process when a person says, it is not quite right here, it's uncanny, or this place is haunted. So he's saying that when we go into these places, we start to unpack them with our experience, and elements that are present within that place take on more of a crystallized form. And this is the point where he's bridging with Durkheim, because he's saying now that what we do is then apply social kinds of things. Okay, so he goes on to say, here we have the obscure basis of meaning and idea rising into greater clarity and beginning to make itself explicit as the notion of a transcendent something, a real operative entity of a numinous kind, which later assumes concrete form as a numen loci, a daemon, an el, a baal, or the like. So what he's saying is that, we find a place in the landscape that gives us a particular feeling, and then we go back there, we do ritual there, we might build a shrine there, or we give it a name, and all of a sudden it takes on a life of its own through the process of social interaction. So you can see how it's a combination of Eliade and Durkheim's perspectives. So maybe this is what's going on here, that there is something in the land, but then it interacts with us through our sort of cultural filters, okay, through the names that we give it. And I guess if we stop giving things names, then we stop interacting with them. Okay. So, this also falls in line with David Hufford's experiential source hypothesis, because it suggests that it's the experience of the place that gives rise to the extraordinary experiences, but also then the beliefs that form around them, or the folklore. And, more recently, parapsychologists have suggested that actually we could think about hauntings as one of the oldest problems in environmental psychology, because it's all about the ways that people relate to and interpret their surroundings. And a haunting experience is a very visceral engagement with a particular place. And I think many of these fairy experiences that we've been talking about, whether they're occurring in a bedroom or whether they're occurring deep in a mine, in a cave, for example, are visceral interactions with place. Okay, so this is the ecological dimension as well, bringing it all together. Okay, so we might then think about this. Another frame that we can bring in is the frame of sacred geography. And the reason I want to bring this frame into this is because I'm teaching on the sacred geography module with the Sophia Center. So what do we mean by sacred geography? Well, here's a lovely little quote from Anthony Thorley, who is actually one of the co-founders of the module that I currently teach, trying to define sacred geography. And he says, sacred geography is the study of qualities of the sacred and related cultural activities found in certain places and expressed in a spatial context. Okay, so that's quite a dry definition, but then he goes on. But if I was allowed to be more adventurous in my conceptual journey, I would say that sacred geography is part of the important post-Enlightenment academic rediscovery of an animistic worldview relevant to Western culture. Okay, so is what we're slowly revealing here with this folklore of giants and fairies and mountain hags, is this a sort of an animistic worldview. And we're living in this period of sort of ecological crisis. Does this sort of folkloric animistic worldview that is revealed have anything to offer us today in our contemporary world? And my suggestion would be that it does. And if you're interested, you can explore the book Greening the Paranormal to see some of the ways that that might play out. Okay, so maybe then this is a sacred geography that is being revealed here, of an animistic living landscape. And I just added this in here, a really interesting little quote here. So there might be some kind of resistance to this idea of using the word sacred in this context, because these fairies and things that we're talking about are not quite the same as the sacred in the sense that we understand it in a church. But the Islamic philosopher Sayyid Hussein Nasser suggests that the sacred is actually the spiritual interrelationship of human beings and the natural environment. So the sacred emerges from our interaction with the natural environment. And that seems to be what these experiences that we've been talking about are, and these folkloric traditions that build up around them, is that people go to particular places, whether into the caves, in the mountains, or into valleys or particular areas where a particular sense of place emerges in them that gives rise to these different systems of belief and folkloric traditions and narratives. So maybe what we're uncovering is a sort of a sacred geography. Okay, so all of this might have some kind of a practical benefit as well. But does this hidden folklore and the experiences that give rise to it reveal this sacred geography of the Tanat Valley? Maybe it does. Maybe it needs to be rediscovered and reconnected with. Okay. So here's the valley with many of its sacred sites marked on it. The fairy hills, the stones, the mountains, and also the relics of these giants as well. So I'll just summarize now. Here's some of my conclusions. So the first point is that there seems to be a forgotten folklore of the Tanat Valley. Some elements of it seem to have survived, but others have disappeared, seemingly below the threshold of awareness. I'm reaching out to people to try and find what is the current contemporary awareness of this folklore. Do people today, or are people today aware of some of the stuff that I've uncovered from journals from the 1930s, for example? It seems not. There are some legends that are well known, as I've already mentioned, like the dragon and Malangesh, and other things that are less well known. But what the folklore that was collected back in the 1930s and in the 1800s suggests is an image of the valleys, the rocks, and the mountains as haunted places. In the sense that Rudolf Otto was talking about, especially in the minds of our ancestors. These places were inhabited by fairies, dragons, or they were created by giants in the mythical past. And we've seen an example of this veneration of these giants as an active participation in landscape through Morris dancing on the cairn. But of course, there's also a reason to consider this psychical component. So it's not just beliefs and stories, because people still have experiences. And I've given you just 2 examples, but I wonder whether other people, contemporary people, have had extraordinary experiences in the Tanat Valley. And I would think that probably they have. And it'd be interesting to see how far these correlate with the folklore that exists. Okay, so there is a reason to consider the psychical component, the experiences that people have in the valley that seem to conform to this forgotten folklore. So is there any experiential source for these folkloric traditions? And is this actually connected to the land in some way, as we've been suggesting? And we can theorize this in different ways. So for Eliade and Otto, there might be an element of the sacred or the numinous dwelling in the land, which would make this valley sort of like a thin place, perhaps, a place where that is ripe for extraordinary encounters. Maybe this is a highly charged place, and that's why we have this folklore and at least some experiences. Whereas for Durkheim, it's all a purely social phenomenon. It's beliefs and stories. Okay, so this is kind of the argument between the experiential source hypothesis and the cultural source hypothesis. But regardless of all of this, even beliefs and stories can be powerful. very powerful. And this hidden folklore might actually represent what Anthony Thorley called this animistic worldview relevant to Western culture, because this folklore is the indigenous understanding of these valleys, okay? Which unfortunately has been lost, but perhaps we need to reconnect with that in some way. So that's it. I'll just add here that, if anyone's watching this and they have an awareness of any folkloric stories from the Tanat Valley, or indeed if they've had any extraordinary experiences of their own in the valley, whether we're talking UFOs, ghosts, or anything in between, psychedelic experiences I would be interested in hearing about as well, then please do get in touch. If you've heard a story from your grandparents or you've had your own experience, you can fill in. I have an anonymous form here where you can submit stories. Or if you want a more personal touch, then you can contact me directly, and here's my email address. So thank you very much. Here's my references, and I hope you have enjoyed it.